an election issue, the worst kind of xenophobia and anti-multicultural attitudes are exposed. So I completely agree with you, and I have nothing critical to say, but I do have 3 questions. And I'm sure they're questions that you must get all the time about the multicultural index. And it comes from thinking about why don't we see a similar sort of questioning of multiculturalism in mainstream in the rest of Canada, I mean the outside Quebec Canada. What makes multiculturalism still kind of a success story in Canada, despite the drift, and I think the temporary reform worker aspect to this is important. And I come up with 3 possibilities, and they really are possibilities that I want to put out there as questions more. What do you think of it? One possibility, one aspect of this, is that multiculturalism really doesn't deal with Canadian diversity. It deals with a very small slice of Canadian diversity, and specifically, unlike the European continent and the different countries that adopt policies that might be considered multiculturalism in Europe, Canada has an Indigenous rights problem, and it just is not counted as part of multiculturalism, properly so. So on the one hand, we end up talking a great deal in the scholarship about the fact that we have the national diversity with Indigenous people in Quebec is what makes us open to pluralism. But in fact, our multicultural policy doesn't deal with the hardest, one of the most difficult aspects of our pluralism. And it leads one to wonder that if multiculturalism was about Indigenous rights in Canada, how popular a policy it would be, and what kind of drift you'd see then. So here I'm thinking it's one thing for the majority, and this is not a problem Europeans have for the most part. So I'd be very interested in how this cashes out in Sweden, actually. And because one of the questions I often get when I travel to the United States or Europe talking about multiculturalism in Canada is, what do you mean it doesn't include Indigenous rights? This is just not understood. And it really doesn't, and that makes it much easier. I noticed on the Multicultural Index, there is no way really to track, in any meaningful way, Indigenous rights on any of the specifications. The second thing is that in Canada, unlike in Britain and probably elsewhere in Europe, multiculturalism is not about race. It is not a way of capturing racism. It is not a way of dealing with racism. It doesn't even, in fact, and we saw this so vividly when the Bouchard-Taylor report reported. Bouchard-Taylor constructed this report on reasonable accommodation. It was supposed to deal with minorities in Quebec, and the minority that was left out, including Indigenous people, which of course you'd expect to be left out, but were the Haitian community, which is one of the most vulnerable communities in Quebec, but it's French-speaking and Catholic, and so it doesn't get in. There's no traction for it to be counted as part of the multicultural problem. So multiculturalism in Canada is not a policy built to deal with racism, quite different from Britain. In Britain, the nascent multiculturalism started in the 1965 Race Relations Act. Some of the great problems of multiculturalism have been discussed in terms of race riots. The great victories of multiculturalism is, of course, the report on the Commission of Racial Equality, led by Bicou Parak, amongst others. So multiculturalism in Britain is about race, and it is right into citizenship policy. In Canada, that scans as very bizarre to us. That's not how we look at it, that's not how we think about it. So the third thing, and this is a more sort of vague idea I have, is that I wonder what a difference it makes that in Canada, the mode by which we understand multiculturalism is reasonable accommodation. And that is not really a mode by which the Americans, I mean, everybody has accommodation policies, but in Canada, if you ask probably anyone in this audience, what is reasonable accommodation? They can give you a pretty intelligent answer to that. Not so in Europe. They don't have the same kind of public philosophy whereby whereby, I mean, in Canada, our Supreme Court has adopted reasonable accommodation. It's been in government reports about how to deal with ethnic diversity as well as religious diversity. And it's about basically you have to accommodate. Employers have to accommodate. Public institutions have to accommodate. Teachers have to accommodate. As long as it's reasonable and up into a point of undue hardship. That's the standard. It's a legal standard. But it's become more than that. It's become kind of public philosophy in Canada. And I just don't see that that is true in Europe. And it's an interesting issue because it's a policy issue that's a discourse issue. It's a way in which we think about it. And I leave it there because I don't really know what to make of it. It's just a question to think about.
You want to hold your horses for a second? You know, because I really would like to. Okay, we have another 15 minutes or so. You can still please, you might want to come back to some of the questions, or do you want to have a short?
No.
Keith, come and sit with us.
Everyone will forget her great questions.
Right. Okay, Manuel, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the talk. The one thing that came to mind is the role of the EU itself,
of the
European Union itself, because you focus on national policies, and so. And the reason I'm asking this is that in the 1990s, the EU started being interested in, human rights and all these issues because of what it was confronted with. And so I was wondering if it would have had an impact, or if you have measured for this. And then just a small question, but when you asked whether religion was one of the important criteria for Quebec, you say to be Canadian. And I was thinking, would it be different if a question had been formulated as to be Quebecer?
It was. It should have been on the. It was.
You might want to be careful with the answer because the EU sponsors his name. Do you want to immediately respond?
Sorry, on the question of. On all the questions, or on?
Yeah. At the moment I don't see any hands. Also.
Oh, okay.
So please.
Well, let me. Anyway, on the Quebec question, question was to be a real Quebecer. Abigail's three, not surprisingly, interesting observations about the process in this country. The first one. That we don't capture, that multiculturalism policy has become focused on the issue of the immigrant experience and does not come to grips with Aboriginal.
Which is fine. I mean, yeah.
No, I understand. Yeah. So just on the index, there's actually three indices, three indices on our website. So we have one for immigrant integration, which measures multiculturalism policies for immigrant minorities. That's what I was using today, but there's a separate and equally lovely index for measuring the extent to which countries have adopted policies to accommodate the distinctive interests of indigenous peoples, and that has indicators like, did they have land title, did they have self-governance, and so on. And then there's a third index, which is for national minorities. And so each one of these indices is tailored to that particular type of minority. So that's why there's nothing, you can't get at the indigeneity question, the Aboriginal peoples, through this index because it was designed for a different purpose. But it is an interesting observation nonetheless that we have three indices, and that's a very Canadian way of thinking of this, right? And it's very much like Will Pimlica's tripartite structure. These are different kinds of diversities. That the people in each of these categories seek different kinds of accommodations, and therefore you have to think of them separately. And we do, and we have three indexes, and we get the same response or questions about it because of that. And I think it's one of the reasons why Europeans have tended to think that the term multiculturalism in the Canadian model is about the sort of maintenance of cultural diversity over time. That it's about the preservation of cultural difference. Because in the case of the Aboriginal peoples and Quebec, that's what it is about. It is based on the assumption that these people will, on this land, continue in perpetuity, and it's a set of policies to try and help that happen. Whereas the immigrant integration policy is not about that. It's about changing the terms of integration. And so I was once pushed up against a wall, almost literally, by the High Commissioner from the UK, who charged, I had said, Canadian policy of multiculturalism is not about the preservation of cultural difference in the long term, and he pushed me up because it absolutely is. Look at what you're doing to your Aboriginal peoples, right? So it certainly affects the way Europeans think of the Canadian model. And it also, you're right, it doesn't, it is quite possible that Canadians are more comfortable with it because, in fact, it isn't dealing with the really tough issues around Aboriginality, which was what your real point was. And so after all of that, I simply concede the point, you're right. The second one on race, you're absolutely right. I think that it's not, well, Canada seeks to respond or deal with those sorts of issues through different instruments, particularly through its charter and through sort of human rights commissions, such as they are now across the country. And so there's a different kind of policy structure and tools to deal with the kind of with racism in the country, and it's an interesting question whether we should embrace and celebrate more vigorously. I mean, should we be giving more profile, and basically, is it really sort of equal rights that's the core issue in a diverse society, or is it part of a multicultural society? There are people who strongly disagree on that question. And your third brilliant point was.
It was just an idea about reasonable accommodation.
Oh yeah. I have to think about that one because it's at this point that I wonder whether the difference between civil law, between legal traditions gets involved here, and that the difference between civil law and the kind of European codes of law deal differently with these things, because the idea of discretion is something that fits more comfortably into a common law tradition. And the civil law tradition in the European context likes to have things pretty codified. And so it may be deeply embedded in legal systems as well. That's not a very effective response.
That's good,
I
thank
was
you.
wondering how salience fits into the level of embeddedness and public opinion with respect to Canadian multiculturalism. So I'm thinking that even for some of the policies in which there's substantial amounts of opposition, if the individuals that really like the policy, it's a really important thing to them, and they're going to show up and vote on that policy, and they're going to write their MPs and organize, correct those policies. If they do that, and the individuals that don't like the policy don't really like organize against the policy can still be fairly embedded, can it not? I wonder if you have any indication of the degree of salience again in public opinion a lot of these kind of policy issues have.
Yeah, we did. The little survey we didn't have a measure of salience. We didn't. I don't think there's anything on which we may have, but the numbers I put up certainly didn't measure salience. But I think you're right. And when I said that there's a set that even though some of the specific attitudes on specifics aren't as enthusiastic as the general principle. I argued that in many cases this is kind of permissive to elites, and I think that's a set. You're perhaps saying more precisely and clearly what I was saying when I said it's kind of permissive. That is, it isn't intensely salient. This isn't something on which the public feels so strongly that it would mobilize or be mobilizable readily around that particular question. So it doesn't become the kind of sensitive boundary that exists elsewhere.
Time for one or two more questions. Please, yeah, maybe you can take two. You first, and then it's you.
Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned ultimately what you observe is that the question of the retreat of multiculturalism is a question of discourse rather than a question of actual.
Sorry, which is
the retreat of multiculturalism is an issue of discourse rather than actual policies at some point. And I'm wondering ultimately, considering how much effective this discourse is in painting multiculturalism as actually a problem, based on which location we're talking about. I'm wondering about, in your study ultimately, how do you define an immigrant ultimately? And how that definition of the immigrant varies from one place to another, and how they should ultimately racism and religion factor into that. And does this affect ultimately the outcome of your study? This is a little question.
Let's take last question, then here for last question.
I hope I'm not repetitive, but I felt like the gentleman's question over there about the role which the European Union has played and should play in the future, like the size of it, whether it's justifiable, and the tension between national sovereignty versus. And to follow up on that, what role the European Union Eastern expansion could play in your analysis?
Both are good questions. On the question of how do we define immigrants, the short answer is that we didn't do it with any sophistication whatsoever. That is to say, we simply included all people born outside the country. And we looked at the ways in which countries had, the policies that were put in place, the multicultural policies put in place to accommodate, recognize those supports. Now, your question and the distinction you're drawing would be really, really important, I think, if we were trying to explain why some countries have more expansive multiculturalism policies than others. That is, this was just a description of differences across countries, and I think there's a really exciting research agenda to explain why some countries go one direction and other countries go other directions, and the composition of the nature, the mix of people the immigrants who come, their cultural difference, either religiously or ethnically or whatever, from the mainstream, how big is that difference, is undoubtedly relevant to an explanation of why some countries go one way and some countries adopt a particular strategy towards integration, and others adopt a more diverse strategy. Europe is incredibly complex on this because, of course, European immigrants from within the EU are treated so much differently than immigrants from outside. So I think your question would be really important in trying to understand why countries do what they do. This was purely a descriptive exercise. It was actually, at one level, intellectually unambitious. We were just trying to describe what the pattern was, and explaining that pattern is something we need to get to. On the EU, I apologize, I didn't engage that. I'm not a specialist in the EU, and I'm going to defer to Oliver and, well, others in the room who know a lot more about it than I do. I think it is quite striking, however, that the EU did play an important role in the development of the idea of civic integration. The model that was developed was set out quite clearly in EU documents, Commission documents, the conception, the components, and so on. Yet, I think it is, and so there was an assumption for a while, and I think Christian Jean, who's one of the scholars who's very prominent in this field, he's a very bright, interesting scholar, tended to assume for a while that it was going to drive a kind of convergence. We're going to get a convergence across European countries around this model. that the model would be articulated, it would become the standard against which countries would make their decisions in this area. And yet, if our numbers are right, there isn't a kind of move to a common model across the countries, that they are making distinctive and different choices, and that there are multiple models out there. So I guess that tells us that the role of the Commission may be important in getting motion on an issue, getting movement, but the models that are emerging domestically are quite different across European countries.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you for coming out on this rainy evening. Thank you, Jean and Abigail, for your comments, in particular, Keith, for basically flying in this morning and flying out tomorrow morning. Greatly appreciated. We bring you back to the BC coast. Bring you more snow this year. Thank you very much.